Really, this event is to launch IDC's strategic position on alternatives to detention. And as a coalition of over 400 organizations and individuals, as well as representatives of communities impacted by immigration detention in 100 countries, we have a shared vision. And our shared vision is a world where immigration detention no longer exists and people who migrate live with rights and dignity. Yeah. So one of our strategies towards this is really to establish rights-based alternatives to detention as best practice. And over the past decade, we, as the IDC, as a coalition, all of us have been together. One of the coalitions that really tried to establish this practice of alternatives to detention in order to reduce and end immigration detention. But as this work has developed, we've recognized the need for greater clarity. Clarity about why we take this approach, why we believe that it is impactful, and the parameters of this approach. Yeah, otherwise, it can be misunderstood and misused. And so it's important that we define and shape the term as rights-based, as community-based alternatives to detention in ways that help to reduce and ultimately end immigration detention. So in this session, we want to share and discuss the IDC's strategic position on ATDs, including our systems change approach, to discuss the alternatives to detention landscape, and to reflect on the principles and building blocks of putting ATDs into practice. Yeah. So we're very glad to have with us an extraordinary panel of speakers who can share their experiences from diverse contexts about how ATD advocacy plays a role in their work to reduce and ultimately end immigration detention. Before we start, before I hand you over to Carolina, who will tell you more about the session, I just have a couple of housekeeping points to share with you all. So firstly, we have interpretation into Spanish for this webinar. So please do use the interpreting function on your app by clicking on the globe icon. Yeah. And secondly, we welcome questions to the panelists, and we'll be opening the chat function to questions following their interventions. So please do introduce yourself, and wherever possible, let us know which panelist your question is directed at. And just finally note that this webinar is being recorded, and we will upload it to IDC's website after the event. Yeah. Without any delay, I hand this over to Carolina, the IDC's Executive Director, to take the session forward.
Thanks, Alice, and hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's very good to see many of you joining from different parts of the world, despite some of the limitations with the time zones. Like following Alice, I want to welcome you to this session, and it's a special occasion for us at IDC because we're launching our strategic position on ATD. And this is what I want to talk about, because this new position paper sets out how IDC and our members and partners use ATD as a systems change strategy towards ending immigration detention. And this means that through our advocacy, we provide a vision and a roadmap towards migration governance approaches that are based on those values that Alice was talking about, on human rights, on fairness, agency, freedom, rather than on coercive approaches. And this actually involves bringing broader changes about migration governance through the implementation of rights-based and community-based alternatives to detention in order to reduce detention, promote those ripple effects, and progressively build the systems that do not rely on immigration detention at all. So the paper contains an analysis of the ATD landscape, both practically and politically, and the key elements that are part of this systems change strategy, and the building blocks for developing the rights-based alternatives to detention. You can find the paper on the IDC's website and also on the materials that were shared for this event. IDC was formed in 2008, and ATD advocacy has been a key area of our work. And we have seen considerable progress over the past 15 years. And given the trajectory of the organization for more than a decade and the momentum around ATD generated during the pandemic, but also taking into account the very concerning global trends on immigration detention, we decided that it was the right time to come together as a coalition and reflect on our ATD strategy. And our aim was to review the progress that we have achieved with the ATD strategy and to tackle the key questions and challenges, and so explore better some of the issues that have arisen after over a decade of evolving this approach and learning, more importantly, from our members and our partners working on the ground. So therefore, IDC undertook targeted consultations with staff, with key members and partners on the ground. And this paper is the result of this collaborative process to take stock and to update and to refine our position on what is effective ATD advocacy. And from this reflection process, there have been a number of learnings that have come through. So I'm going to speak about 3 learnings. The first one is related to our purpose and vision as an organization. And back in 2008, we were a young and growing coalition trying to navigate very complex national, regional, and global decision-making environments. And IDC worked at that point under the vision of ending unnecessary detention. But in recent years, this premise has been challenged both internally and externally. And through thoughtful reflection and consultation with our network, we have developed a new vision, which is a world where immigration detention no longer exists and where people who migrate live with their rights and dignity. And this is our purpose as an organization, and our strategic direction therefore reflects our aim to move towards that world without immigration detention. And that this is very clear for us. So our overall approach has also remained solutions focused, but because we continue to work collaboratively with a range of stakeholders, including grassroots groups and civil society organizations, leaders with lived experience of detention, UN agencies and governments, and is focusing on these practical solutions and identifying ways in which migration governance systems can be designed without the use of detention. The second key learning through our consultations is related to articulating what we believe ATD must look like to work towards ending immigration detention. And as a result of these reflections, we believe that there are certain principles that we need to adhere to ensure that ATD contributes to this core purpose of ending detention. So the first one is that ATD must respect human rights. And this means ATD must support the agency and leadership of the people to effectively navigate those very complex migration processes that impact directly on their lives. And simultaneously, ATD must increase the ability of institutions and individuals to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of those they engage with, and also be accountable when they do not. Second is that ATD must use an intersectional approach. So ATD must uphold the full humanity and dignity of every person and recognize that people at risk of immigration detention experience multiple and intersectional violations of their human rights. So for example, ATD needs to be gender responsive, and it needs to recognize the very specific impact that immigration detention has on women, girls, transgender, gender diverse, and LGBTI+ communities. The third is that ATD must create no new harms. So ATD must not create those harms or further any violation of any rights. So ATD must not be used to place restrictions on individuals who would otherwise not be detained. And again, there is quite a lot of clarity on this as a condition. The fourth one is that ATD must reduce immigration detention. So approaches that run parallel to existing immigration detention systems, but without impacting the use of detention or the size of immigration detention, by nature do not reduce immigration detention. ATD must reduce immigration detention. The fifth is that ATD must be based on engagement and not enforcement. And this means moving away from coercive approaches and focusing on engagement-based ATD. And this is about building trust, promoting agency, well-being, so that people can actively participate in all the processes that affect their lives. And finally, ATD must involve holistic support. So it should be centered around holistic community-based support to help people to achieve stability and to navigate complex systems, and ensuring access to services and well-being. So many of our members across the world are already working under these principles on the ground and are attempting to reduce immigration detention with a view to end immigration detention through ATD pilots, through advocacy efforts, and to different initiatives. And we are very lucky because we'll be hearing from some of them later today during the panel discussion. But also, I just talk about the principles of ATD, but we also felt it was important to clarify what we believe is not ATD. And IDC believes that measures that amount to any deprivation of liberty, individually or cumulatively, are de facto detention. So this is sometimes referred as alternatives form of detention, and it's very important to differentiate between alternatives to detention and de facto detention. And this is regardless of whether they are labeled ATD by governments or not. And some examples of these include closed shelters or reception facilities, remote or physical isolated locations where people actually do not have in reality freedom of movement, screening on international borders or transit zones, electronic monitoring or tagging, and overly onerous conditions and restrictions. So we believe it's important, this part of what is, but what it isn't. A key learning, the third, for us during this process has been the question of ATD languages and terminology. So we are a global organization, but we have a localized worldview. And we work to be grounded by our relationships with members and partners on the ground. And we have learned that using the term ATD can be useful in some contexts because it clearly links the practical reality of detention with the solutions to try to reduce and end it. And this is the case particularly, for instance, in contexts where immigration detention is a growing problem and when this is urgent, and where somehow civic space is limited. However, there are other contexts where it could be advisable to not explicitly use the term while working on the implementation of ATD and different initiatives that also reduce the use of detention. So in short, using the term ATD can be a strategic choice in different contexts and sometimes not in others. So our stance as IDC is that as we move through our theory of change, the aim is for the term ATD to become obsolete, as what happens is that non-detention becomes the norm, and there are new value-based mechanisms and processes that are integrated into migration realities. In the meantime, it is important for us to mitigate the risk of using the term ATD in certain circumstances, and this is as governments remain in enforcement mode, and understanding that some of them have co-opted the term and use it to describe coercive measures that increase control or surveillance rather than reducing detention and enhancing rights. So some of our members and partners I find it very useful, and we find it useful to talk about reclaiming and shaping what real ATD should mean and how it should look. So the bottom line in terms of using this term is that organizations and groups on the ground are the best place to identify the risk and the mitigation strategies. And they do this as part of these iterative advocacy approaches that respond to changing environments. And this is an ongoing task for us as civil society. ATD it's also important to clarify that ATD is one of the strategies towards ending immigration detention. And in addition to the key learnings, we have some themes that have come through our consultations. So this is part of seeing ATD as part of a whole ecosystem of change to end immigration detention, and also ensuring that our work is very rooted in local context and experience. So on that first point, we are a global civil society coalition of members and partners, and we actively engage in so many different and varied and innovative strategies to reduce and to end immigration detention. So grassroots groups, we have grassroots groups, academics, researchers, lawyers, service providers, community organizers, and leaders with lived experience. And we believe that in order to ensure a very healthy and very vibrant ecosystem of change, diverse approaches from different actors are necessary as part of the movement to end immigration detention. Because this is how social change actually happens, is by adding these different and complementary approaches that are very targeted to context. So the paper outlines a number of different tactics, for instance, campaigning, advocating for to release people from detention, changing policy through strategic litigation, changing public narratives through strategic communications, and many others. But for us at IDC, it's a key part of our chosen strategy to respond to the current challenges of our times and to pursue our solution-based approach, which we believe is quite impactful. So none of these approaches should be seen as exclusive of each other. It's the opposite. They can complement each other, and they are part of this multi-layered strategy towards the world that we want to see without immigration detention. The second is about the context. And it's about being context specific, because this strategy is only relevant to contexts where immigration detention is a practical reality that needs to be addressed. In contexts that do not use immigration detention, those contexts can provide learning and inspiration for us, using ATD as a strategy in other places and for migration management systems that do not rely on immigration detention. In our experience at IDC, change is always context specific, and across the world, immigration detention changes so much depending on which region and which country you're looking at. And it's depending on specific drivers, political, historical, migration context. So the strength of using ITD as a strategy specifically is that the approach can be tailored to those specific and complex realities and can address the unique gaps and opportunities. So we work in different countries across the world that are completely different on this issue, and also on the use of immigration detention, and also on the experiences of the people that are impacted by detention, as well as the openness of governments to engage or not engage with civil society. And we also work on ATD for people with a range of intersectional identities, children, women, LGBTI plus people, as well as those experiencing racial, ethnic, religious discrimination, people seeking asylum, stateless people, residents, people with convictions, victims of trafficking, undocumented migrants, etc. Many of them impacted by immigration detention in different ways in different parts of the world. So we believe for this strategy to be impactful, it must be grounded in pragmatic and contextualized approaches that work towards realizing those correct principles and values. Because again, I say there is no one-size-fits-all model, and the process of change, as well as the ATD intervention, will look differently depending on where we are. I just want to finish this presentation talking about human impact, because I believe that when we are trying to, when we're working with trying to achieve social change, what we need to always consider is the human impact of the sort of issues we're talking about. And so in this case, the human impact of detention and the human benefits of ATD. And this should guide all our efforts. So when talking about ending immigration detention, we need to illustrate how rights-based ATD can have an actual effect on the lives of people that are affected by detention. So let's think about Natalia, who is a 16-year-old girl and her younger brother, who escaped threats of gang violence in their country. And they arrived in a transit country, they were separated and detained for a month. They were then placed in an ATD program where the two siblings were living together in the same house and able to speak with their family, having their own beds, their books, caregivers, and attending an education program. And the quote of Natalia was, "It was very different from detention. I felt light again after many months of being in the dark." So when thinking about this sort of lived experience, like the case of Natalia, it's not just about storytelling. Storytelling is the list of the issues. It's about leadership, because we must always remember that when deciding which strategies we are going to use as civil society, migrant and refugee-led groups, particularly those leaders with lived experience of detention, they are the ones driving the change on the ground. And that they are the best place to understand the challenges of the communities and the potential solutions. And today we're lucky because some of our panelists will share more on this with us today. For IDC, as we move forward with our advocacy around rights-based ATD, the lived experience of people like Natalia will remain front and center of our work. The fight to end detention cannot remain at this abstract level up there. And we see reflections of ATD as an important way of moving forward in our work, but it cannot just be found on reports or papers or strategies. The human cost of immigration detention is what gives us the actual moral imperative to act and to work together to find these practical and transformative and long-term strategies and the combination of the strategies to accomplish this vision of this world where immigration detention is not there, doesn't exist, and where people who migrate live with rights and dignity. So thank you for listening to me. And I'm very, very happy right now to pass on the floor to Mishka that will be taking us through our panel today. I hope you enjoy.
Hey, many thanks, Carolina. Okay, hello all. Yeah, and thanks all for joining us today. And as Carolina mentioned, I will be moderating the panel discussion, and we have 4 brilliant speakers. And we will also have Carolina as well to close the panel with, I would say, end for panel reflections. So after the panel, there will be 10 minutes Q&A session for panelists, and the chat function will be open after the panelist intervention to pose questions from the audience. But I will remind when the chat is open for the audience to pose questions. So I think it's time. Let's move on to the panel discussion then. And let me introduce our first speaker, Anderson Selvasegaram. Anderson is the founding executive director of the Suka Society in Malaysia, which protects and preserves the best interests of children. In 2015, Suka Society won the prestigious United Nations Malaysia Award, and Anderson is currently working with the Malaysian government to implement the Alternatives to Detention pilot project for unaccompanied and separated minors. Anderson is going to talk about how developing an ATD strategy has been useful for an organization working in an extremely challenging context, such as Malaysia, in which criminalization of migrant is a constantly growing trend. And he will also focus on unaccompanied children, talk about how the focus on unaccompanied children as an endpoint to be able to develop an ATD pilot program, and also the importance of grassroots and organizations working on the ground in developing and carrying out ATD strategies, as well as planning and developing ATD programs in partnership with the government. Over to you, Anderson.
Thank you very much. I thought I will start maybe by quoting a sentence from the IDC position paper that really resonated with me, and my reflection for our discussion would be based upon it. ATD advocacy is one of the many strategies that civil society can utilize to achieve progress towards reducing detention and help pave the way for future systems of migration governance that do not rely on detention. 10 years ago, when we first advocated for ATDs in Malaysia, a country that uses detention as a transit point before deportation, our ATD journey was really a journey of chipping away existing norms and practices whilst providing tangible solutions. As a child-focused organization, our first engagement with immigration was to conduct child awareness and sensitization programs for immigration detention officers in detention. We felt that was important because we needed to remove the predominant view among, and this is not just with government, but also with the general public, that the population in detention were just undocumented migrants. We needed to humanize their perspective, to start seeing that the detention population was made up of people who are children, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, those who are unwell, those who are with disabilities, those who are victims, and so on. In our awareness engagements, for example, to the public were genuinely surprised when they were informed that there are actually kids in immigration detention. In our training sessions with the immigration detention officers, their thoughts when discussing about children in detention would inevitably direct the officers to reflect, what if my own kids were in detention? These efforts were strategic, and as we felt that our low-hanging fruit in terms of what is achievable, would be the concerns of children affected by immigration detention. But it was still extremely challenging to shift the conversation from detention to alternatives. I give you an example. In our training with for the immigration officers, for example, we included a hypothetical discussion that was framed like this, right? If the government were to shift its position to stop children from being placed in immigration detention, what are some alternative to detention suggestion would the officers themselves offer to their supervisors? The reality was that the predominant answer would be to hasten the deportation process. As such, we felt that it was important that we own the narrative of what we mean when we are talking about alternatives. Why? Because we need the conversation of alternatives to remain human rights based. So taking lessons from ISS Hong Kong, who was involved in our initial roundtable discussion and their pilot program, we pushed for a tangible solution-based ATD pilot project. We asked for an ATD pilot that allowed a rolling release of unaccompanied and separated minors into short-term transitional shelters and subsequently into longer-term community placement programs. To us, it was important because to effectively advocate with the government to change a system that only knows of detention, it is important that our goals were tangible and we remain solution-focused. I remember in meetings with the government officers, the officer would tell us that civil societies are quick to criticize officers whom they say that they're only doing what is duty bound for them to do, which is to detain. And to be honest, if we think about it, I mean, it is a fair remark, right? In a sense, to answer the criticism of local civil society and not being solution-based enough, we now are pushing for, and we now have a tangible solution in the form of an ATD pilot to push and that would serve as the sharpest end of our advocacy effort. A long time later, and I would say it is long, 9 years to be precise, after 3 changes of the local government, multiple government officers coming and going, and in that time, we also started our own case management program for unaccompanied separated minors at risk of immigration detention. In 2021, last year, we finally have the Malaysian cabinet approving to start the ATD pilot for unaccompanied and separated minors. Just maybe 3 points to end this reflection. The first is that we need wisdom to constantly weigh between what is our win that we need to take and build upon, and what is something we do not take because it does not fulfill all the ideals we are pushing for in our advocacy. For example, our ATD pilot came with certain conditions, as we could only work with, of course, we're advocating for this, unaccompanied separated minors. We could also only work with certain communities with very limited durable solutions. So therefore, we're not able to look at the needs of all children, their families in detention, and therefore limiting how inclusive the pilot would be. So the question is, because we want to progressively create and build the ATD space, do we therefore take that as a win? Start the pilot, push further for a more inclusive solution, or do we wait and not accept because it does not fulfill all the ideals of an ATD initiative? And that's something which, constantly need wisdom and knowledge to really push and understand so that we can advocate further. Secondly, we also need to constantly push for a mindset shift. When it comes to detention, when having conversations with the government, security will always be the conversation they are willing to talk about or want to talk about. So the challenge is always about how, maybe in our context as a children-focused organization, how do we shift the conversation from security to child protection? from security to best interest of the child. And therefore, having a different space to have that conversation, looking at different conventions, whether it's the UNCRC or local laws that protect children to use in that conversation. Thirdly, our ATD advocacy journey. The ATD pilot has always been the first tangible goal, but certainly not the last. What we need was the collective collaboration of civil society stakeholders to be pushing beyond the pilot. This is where we need specialists from various civil society groups, whether it is children-focused organizations like us, women and family organizations, to legal advocacy type organizations or medical type organizations, to develop their own ATD strategies to push for a wider application of ATDs in our country. For a small organization like us, our capacity and resources limits us to focus on advocating for ATD pilot, for children. But obviously, there are many categories of people in immigration detention, and this is not just a children-related issue. So beyond ATDs, we need separate streams of advocacy spearheaded by various stakeholders to push for ATDs so that collectively we would reduce the use of immigration detention. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anderson. And reflection-wise from Anderson's intervention, Anderson talked about the importance of humanizing the issue of immigration detention and also using children as an starting point or an entry point in the ATD strategy, and also why it's important to make sure that ATDs are focused on human rights, and also why it's important to be solution focused for the civil society organization as well, who are calling for alternative detention or ATDs, and the importance of constant effort to change the focus of the governments, who are mainly focused on immigration detention as well as enforcement, and the importance of collaboration among the civil society. And one thing after hearing from Anderson, one thing that came to my mind was the solution to the issue of detention must come from people who are impacted by the issue, but as well as people who are working on the ground, grassroots organization, who basically know very well the impact the detention has on people. Whether it's people who are directly affected or people who are working on the ground, who see the effect of immigration detention constantly. Thanks a lot, Anderson. And on that note, we are going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Pina Aksu. Pina is a human rights campaigner, facilitator, theatre maker, and first-year PhD candidate exploring art and injustice in immigration movement in Scotland. In her work at Maryhill Integration Network in Scotland, she coordinates community projects to welcome asylum seekers and refugees. She's also a facilitator with Active Inquiry and World Spirit Theatre, and also she received the Amnesty Brave Award in 2020. Pina will be talking about why community-based solutions are the core of right-based and people-centered ATDs, as well as how community projects and models are effectively welcoming people, creating a safe space, and supporting case resolution. And she will also talk about the impact of immigration detention and the benefit of being in the community from an advocate with lived experience perspective. Over to you, Pina.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Mishka, and thank you to everybody for joining today. And it's a great pleasure to share some of the experience we are currently doing in Glasgow, in Scotland, in the UK, and maybe touch on a lot of some of the aspects of the problems that we are seeing at the moment in terms of people being detained. So in the UK at the moment, there are over 11 immigration removal centres, which we call it as detention centres. And there is currently one detention centre in Scotland, which is the only detention centre in Scotland. And as we know, during the pandemic time, especially in the UK and across the world, the idea of detaining people and the idea of bordering has become more apparent, especially trying to put people in detention center for a longer period of time, rather than making sure that people are there when they are being assessed or at the end of their cases. Some of the work that I do at my workplace, we would consider that as an alternative to detention, without knowing is an alternative to detention, or without labeling as the ATD. And the reason for that is because that's the normal way of how we should be welcoming people, and that's the normalized way of how people should be treated when they arrive in the communities. A lot of the work that we do are centered around in the communities, especially from when they arrive, the first day that they arrive, and that's part of the strategy we follow, that the integration and welcoming people starts from day one. So rather than people being placed into a detention center or people being placed into various different accommodations, we believe that for people to be part of a community, they should be in the communities from day one. So a lot of the projects that we are currently doing is making sure that this is at the center, that people are at the center in terms of making sure that they understand their rights. And this is one of the key aspects when it comes to detention and various aspects of rights, is making sure that people are provided with the correct information and they know about their legal rights, and they know about their rights in terms of what happens when they are claiming asylum, at what process they could be at risk, and what happens when they are in the risk of being detained as well. So these are some of the methods and works that we do at the moment. Unfortunately, during the COVID in the UK, there has been a new method of detaining people, which we call it as hotel detention. A lot of the people, when they have been arriving, so they are usually being provided with housing in the communities, but during the COVID-19, people were evicted from their homes and then they were put into hotel accommodations across the country. And this now has been a normal new form of putting people into houses. So rather than giving people the opportunity to be in the communities, now they're being placed into hotel accommodations. And a lot of the organizations and campaigners call this as a hotel detention, because we don't differentiate the way that people are detained in a physical detention form and the way that people are being detained in a hotel accommodation. And this, we find that this is a really concerning issue for the people who are being welcomed into the communities, but for their well-being and for the future of the implementation of how the immigration system works in the country. As you might also know, in the UK, they are currently talking and proposing a new immigration bill, which is the Nationality and Borders Bill. And as part of this proposal with the bill, they are thinking of creating an offshore asylum process centre, which we call it as an offshore detention. So they are, I think, closely looking at the example of Australia, where they are trying to build an offshore centre while their cases are being processed. For the third sector and for the organizations who support asylum seekers and refugees, we're extremely concerned with this method because we feel that this violates people's rights and it takes a step further in detaining people and forming a new method of detention where it's going to make it a little more challenging in terms of to let people out back into the communities. From our perspective, we believe that it's extremely important that we continue and make sure that people are in the communities rather than they are being detained behind prison-like conditions, which is how a lot of the organizations describe. We also believe that the impacted community, as Mishka earlier mentioned, and Anderson mentioned as well, that they feel empowered and they have the voice to share their experiences of the places that they are being held in. So whether if it's a detention center or a condition-like detention center, that they are aware of their rights and they are given the opportunity to speak about how they could create change. And I think from IDC point of view, the development of the community leadership curriculum was a really powerful tool for the communities to use as a way of understanding the impact of detention and understanding how change could be made. Just to show an example of why as a community and why we believe that detention should be ended and we need to make sure that people are in the communities was a really powerful example from last year. Just going to briefly summarize it, and I'm not sure if everybody's aware of what happened last year in Glasgow. There was 2 people who were being tried to be detained and to put into a detention centre in Glasgow by the Home Office. And the whole community came together to stop this detention and deportation potentially. And by the end, the 2 people were let out from the van when the Home Office officials arrived, and there was a great community solidarity, and that raised a lot of awareness for the local people to have an understanding of what is detention, why are people being put into detention after claiming asylum for, let's say, 5 years later or 10 years later. What is the purpose of having this place where people are going to be detained, when in reality people could be in the communities where they will have the support from the local community, where they will network with each other, and where they will have a cultural understanding of the surrounding and of the new community that they are being that they have migrated to. So this had a huge outrage and understanding in the general public about the usage of detention, and there was a lot of people discussing about why we need detention centres as well. So there is currently, just relating from the community solidarity to the government solidarity, not solidarity, the government pressure, I would word, as Mishka would agree as well, at the moment, is the campaigners such as from Detention Action, Right to Remain, and many of the grassroots groups at the moment are trying to engage and oppose the Nationality and Borders Bill, because that is going to tighten the border control we have already in the UK, but it's also going to dehumanize and find different methods of detaining people. And one of the things that we were talking about was even the term alternative to detention. And I think at the very end, it summarizes really nicely to say that we need a system change if we want to achieve ending detention. And I think that's why we are all on this call, to understand what else we can do and how else systematically we can use the skills that we have, also the skills that the people have, and the campaigning skills that we have as well, to make sure that in the long term we have a system change, so that we don't see and witness detention in our borders and also in our communities as well. So I'll just end by saying thank you for the report, and it's an ongoing work that we all have to do, unfortunately, because the rise of the right-wing governments are not going to stop anytime soon. So it's extremely important that we always remember the solidarity we have, and also concentrate on the system, longer term system change that we all have a role to play in. And I'll just end here. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Pina. Thanks a lot. And Pina, from reflection wise from Pina's intervention, Pina covered about the importance of community-based approach, where people are welcome and supported, and importantly, people feel like they are a part of the community. And Pina also gave a real life example in Glasgow. I remember that even really well, where we saw the great community solidarity when 2 people were trying to, when the authorities tried to detain 2 people. And also Pina talked about the importance of people having the access to vital information while they are navigating the migration process. And in the context of in the UK, we see a new trend of the government basically focusing on de facto detention practices, and also the possibility of, or the real threat of, offshore detention. From my reflection, I think from what Pina covered about, immigration detention is harmful, and effective case management in the community is essential support. such as access to legal advice, healthcare, and also a community to foster as well as I would say involve are all important to people's well-being and welfare. And this is important when people are navigating the immigration processes, because this will also help better case resolution. And none of these are possible while people are in immigration detention. On that note, I'm going to pass on to our next speaker, Katharina Opser. Katharina is the Director of Women's Refugee Commission Migrant Right and Justice Program in the United States, where she advocates for the rights of women, children, as well as families seeking protection. She has authored numerous reports on asylum, detention, and case management alternatives to detention in the United States, as well as European refugee European refugee response. Katharina will be talking about the importance of delinking ATD from the enforcement practices and reclaiming the concept as reclaiming the ATD concept as a concept based on rights, as well as case management in the community, as well as progress and setback on the ATD strategy in challenging political context, and also the challenge of government appropriation of the term ATD and the need for the civil society movements to reclaim the term while being a part of the ATD conversation. Over to you, Katharina.
Thank you so much, Mishka. I'm so grateful to be here today with all of you to talk more about advocacy around alternatives to detention, specifically in the US context. We have partnered so long with International Detention Coalition, and we're so grateful for the important research and advocacy and work that IDC has led globally. And exactly as Mishka said, I think what I would love to talk more about today is to share more about the US context and history of advocacy on ATD here, where we really have been on quite a challenging trajectory in the last few years. I think the US example really underscores the importance of context when thinking about IDC's ATD strategy, because in the US context, we have had both important examples where, in my view, incremental change has represented important progress, but we've also seen some of the ways in which longer term and more comprehensive change is up against really powerful political forces. And so in other words, focusing on ATD has been both helpful at some times and in other times, quite frankly, also really challenging. So I just want to give a brief history of where we are now, of how we've gotten to where we are now, which is that in the late 1990s, there was an initial and very highly successful, from the perspective of the government, pilot that emphasized some forms of case management. And that was really the last time for a very long time that the US government invested in a program that it called Alternatives to Detention, that actually had some grounding in case management principles. Every program that the US calls ATD, or Alternatives to Detention, since has focused almost exclusively on programming that by any definition here or in the IDC strategy would not in fact be considered an alternative. And that's for two really specific reasons. First, the vast majority of ATD programs, again, programs that the government calls ATD, are grounded in electronic monitoring, and specifically in the use of ankle monitors that track people limited to certain geographic areas. So current ATD programs incorporate ankle monitors or tracking through smartphones. And in fact, just recently, the US government has put out a proposal for a pilot that consists of a partial house arrest program, in which a participant will be forced to remain in their home for several hours a day, which of course limits ability to work or provide care and so much more. The sole and primary contractor for these programs, which the program in the US is called the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program, or ISAP, is a company that is a subsidiary of one of the largest for-profit private prison companies in the United States, the GEO Group. So it is not being actually provided or resourced to a local and experienced community-based organization. And while in this ISAP electronic monitoring program, there has also been some inclusion of case management, and including now, I should say, to some services that are actually contracted to local organizations as opposed to just through the GEO Group's affiliate, that case management has always been completely insufficient. It does not support a sort of supportive and holistic approach to supporting someone with finding stability in their community or successfully navigating the immigration process. It's incredibly superficial and not driven by evidence-based practices and principles. And then finally, all of the ATD that currently exist as government programming are housed in the same agency, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, that is responsible for detention and enforcement and deportation of those who are in the immigration process, which inherently creates distrust and tension between those who are enrolled or any service providers who might be providing those services and the agency who is funding those services. But the second reason that alternatives to detention as defined by the US don't actually meaningfully qualify as alternatives is very simply that they have not reduced detention. There were a number of years under the Obama administration where detention levels would stay roughly the same while some of these programs increased. So that was already problematic. But then once we had the Trump administration, the situation grew far worse, where we had detention capacity, which in the US is entirely in jails or jail-like facilities, that skyrocketed. Whereas ATD grew in part because it was Congress who at this point was supporting the use of ATDs. The Trump administration tried to not have anything to do with ATDs because they were so focused on detention. And so if you look at IDC's principles of what constitutes a true alternative to detention, where we have a holistic and non-enforcement oriented community-based support program, this is not, that also serves to reduce the use of detention. This is not what we see in the US. And at the same time, the government has managed to successfully co-opt this idea of what an ATD is. If you ask government officials about ATD, they will accept that it is these electronic monitoring programs. And that's a problem that civil society has for years now worked to push back on, and that we have done with some success, at least in certain contexts. And that's also very critical to the work that's happening now in the United States. I do also want to share some examples of what I would consider success. I don't know that there is full consensus by everyone that this would be seen as success, but where I do think the lens of the strategy that's been outlined here has been incredibly important to creating change in the United States. So most critically, after there was extensive advocacy with the Obama administration, and of course also after the Obama administration had restarted the practice of detaining families, at the time in 2016, the administration created what was called the Family Case Management Program. And that program for the first time represented real buy-in from the government to a more community-oriented and case management-centric approach to ATD, instead of relying only on the electronic surveillance that makes up these other programs I've talked about. That program existed in 5 cities. It supported families seeking asylum in the United States and really emphasized the importance of providing appropriate referrals to services and creating stability in the community as much as it did having there be compliance with the immigration process. And that was a real shift from the prior ways that ATD had been framed. And from the government's perspective, it was hugely successful. Over 99% of people who were enrolled in this program attended all of their court hearings and all of their immigration appointments. But even that program, I just need to note, was flawed. I actually wrote an evaluation of that program. And again, because it was housed in ICE, in this enforcement agency, and because ICE awarded that program contract initially, again, to a subsidiary of the GEO Group, so a for-profit private prison company, there are clear lessons and examples of how such a model needs to be improved in the future if the government, again, invests in community-based case management. And it's telling because the Biden administration now has put forward, in addition to some of these very terrible ideas, some new case management ideas, but we continue to see that they are linked to the same sort of flawed ideas of living in ICE, and being linked clearly to enforcement and not serving to reduce detention. The Family Case Management Program was terminated shortly after the Trump administration took office for very much political reasons. So it's another example where we had progress, but where forces that were bigger than civil society changed course on that progress. So I want to just end by talking a little bit about where we are today and where in the specific US context, we've had some progress and where we've had some setbacks. First, we've had a lot of work done to gain understanding among partners and some extent media that, as IDC has long argued, ATD must be seen as something much greater than a single program or even any programming at all, that it really represents it's a wide spectrum of all the things that are not detention. But where we continue to have challenges is this idea of dispelling both among US policymakers and lawmakers that electronic surveillance is not an ATD, and that detention has to be reduced for an ATD to actually be an ATD. We've also been really successful in increasing understanding and support of specifically a more community-based case management approach, and specifically in the context of US Congress. Under the Trump administration, and despite their repeated attempts to undermine any concept of ATD, even ones we wouldn't agree with, there were an increasing number of US lawmakers who spoke out in support of the need for case management in a way that we hadn't seen before. And even without being asked, Congress funded a new case management pilot program that, while very small, may hold some promise in creating a new model of government-funded case management. There's growing consensus among US civil society who's working on this of the need to move longer-term community. Oh, am I out of time?
No, you have 30 seconds left.
I'm almost done. Of the need to move community-based support outside of the agencies tasked with detention and deportation. And while that's a much longer term effort of building political will and support, it's also a significant progression in the work that's been driven so much by the important research, thought work, and good examples that we see internationally. So simply put, we think that support should be based in the community. It should be intentional and well-resourced. It should be for those who truly seek it out or need it, rather than sort of a blanket requirement that should be forced on someone, and that it has to be divorced from enforcement and surveillance and must exist alongside a reduction in detention, and can't just be measured by compliance, but also by metrics that show that someone has found stability in the community. And so I'll end there and leave the US context again as an example where the kind of strategic thinking in IDC's important paper has had both really meaningful impact and created change, but also reminds us that it's not a one-size-fits-all model across the world and the political environments that we operate in. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Katerina. Yeah, and I mean, reflection-wise from Katerina's intervention, what I get that changing in political context can have an impact on our ATD strategies, and also why it's important for the government to have an active as well as real desire to create positive change and work with the grassroots organizations as well as civil society to design, invest, and expand rights-based ATDs and move away their focus from immigration detention. And this basically needs a cultural change as well as a mindset change within the governments that consider immigration detention as well as other invasive practices as necessary tools for migration management. And more importantly, reflection-wise, it's very important to dealing the ATDs from practices that restrict people's liberty and freedoms. And we need to define what ATDs are. And the civil society organizations as well as grassroots organizations need to reclaim the term ATD and also importance of having an ATD strategy. And on that note, I'm going to pass on to our final speaker, who is Oktay. And Oktay is the Director of Refugee Rights Turkey in Istanbul. And he's where Refugee Rights Turkey is a leading legal service provider for asylum-seeking children, as well as other vulnerable migrants in Turkey, including people in detention. They advocate for improvements in legislation and policy on national level and train lawyers on legal as well as judicial protection interventions in asylum and immigration cases. Oktay will talk about how Refugee Rights Turkey try to engage in ATD advocacy in Turkey context as a strategy to promote a protection-sensitive approach to irregular migration management and people on the move at large. And he will also talk about how legal principles and policy conversations around ATDs present opportunities for a positive forward-looking dialogue with the government counterparts and migration policy decision makers. Over to you, Oktay.
Thank you, Mishka. And hello, everyone. Only a few words on the Turkey migration context before I move on to how my organization, Refugee Rights Turkey, conceives of alternatives to detention and what we aim to achieve by ATD advocacy. In Turkey, over 4 million registered refugees and asylum seekers, Syrians and others. But on top of that, also annually, on average, 250 to 300,000 apprehensions and detention of refugees and migrants on the move. In terms of the composition of who gets to be apprehended and detained in the Turkey context, the majority are people from refugee-producing countries of origin, mainly Afghans and others, who are apprehended either upon arrival along Turkey's long eastern and southern land borders, or on their way to an attempted border crossing to the EU. A by and large good level of rights and safeguards in law on the basis of an EU-inspired domestic law framework, but an implementation on the ground that lags behind in some important ways the rights and safeguards in law for a variety of reasons. Significant investment by the government of Turkey in recent years to expand immigration detention capacity, 20+ modern large-scale facilities with a cumulative holding capacity of over 15,000, but then also some important promising first steps taken towards relying more substantially in the coming years on non-detention alternatives. Important first steps in the shape of dedicated ATD provisions introduced to law in late 2019, and still emerging, yet to be expanded ATD practices on which we hope to build. So today I want to talk about where we see the potentials and added value of ATD advocacy going forward, including by raising issues and recommendations concerning some of the measures and conditionalities envisioned. We engage in ATD advocacy in Turkey with two objectives in mind. Our first and more immediate objective, of course, is to achieve a substantive reduction in qualification in the use of detention as a migration management tool. Presumption of liberty, detention is an exceptional last resort measure that must be legally justifiable. Its necessity must be shown. Procedural safeguards should be in place to protect individuals from arbitrariness, notification, independent legal counsel, right to appeal. Migration management objectives can be achieved through non-detention alternative measures. But beyond this immediate and important in itself objective of reducing use of detention, we also consider that the legal principles and policy conversation around ATDs, but also specifically IDC's holistic and engagement-based ATD concept, offer a very useful framework of reference for engaging migration policy decision makers to promote what we characterize as a protection-sensitive approach to migration governance. IDC proposes rights-based ATDs that rely on cooperation and engagement as distinct from restriction enforcement, with an emphasis on individual circumstances and needs, effective screening for vulnerabilities, due consideration of how individuals should be supported to allow for investment in migration procedures, and a case management approach that allows individuals to pursue the full range of legitimate migration options for which they qualify. Yes, states do have sovereign authority to govern entry and presence of foreign nationals, but they are bound by legal obligations, international human rights law, international refugee law, to fully respect the rights of persons concerned. International protection needs trigger state obligations, vulnerabilities trigger state obligations, children trigger state obligations, families trigger state obligations, and so forth. So if therefore states are obligated, which our counterparts are going to recognize, to manage migration in this protection-sensitive way, how do you ensure that in practice? For us in the Turkey context, in engaging for advocacy purposes, IDC's ATD concept presents an argument for individualized assessment of the conditions and needs of every person on the move. Put in place a truly individualized a screening and assessment procedure to not only assess grounds for removal, also systematically screen for non-removal grounds, where you identify grounds for removal, systematically consider first non-detention measures pending removal, consider whether detention is necessary, where you opt to detain as a last resort, as an exceptional measures, duly justify it. Where vulnerabilities are identified, categorically refrain from detention. IDC's holistic approach requires states to recognize that for individuals to be engaged, to cooperate in migration governance, they need to be supported. You need to provide documentation, cover for basic needs, but you also need to make arrangements for individuals to effectively access independent information, advice, legal assistance, and representation if needed, in order to get a fair opportunity to understand, explore, and exhaust the full range of legal migration options as a key prerequisite for the individual to have confidence in the fairness and integrity of the limitations and obligations with which they are faced with. So, conversely, from the viewpoint of authorities, this also would require them to recognize that migration management is not a one-way street to departure from the country, but must also provide effective access to opportunities for legal stay. So, in our approach, arguing and advocating for alternatives in Turkey context, we present it as an argument for a truly individualized approach to irregular migration management, which is considerably lacking in our context. We present it as an argument for migrants to be offered a fair opportunity to explore the full range of legally sanctioned migration options, an argument against the presumption that eventual departure from the country of origin is the only conceivable outcome in a migration case, an argument for a holistic approach that includes, among other requirements, access to independent legal advice and assistance, in order to empower refugees and migrants on the move to effectively access rights, but also to allow authorities to fully live up to their legal obligations. So in concluding my remarks, let's be clear, and we are not ignorant to the fact that we are engaged in an uphill, long-haul effort. I think this applies globally. We are counteracting a political climate, certainly the case in Turkey, and entrenched presumptions which propose that detention is a necessary migration management tool, even where it comes with significant financial costs and human costs. We are also working to counterbalance an area of state jurisdiction which states and state agents considered sacrosanct, states' authority to control movement across national borders. So in this context, and to echo Carolina, we advocate for ATDs as one among other methodologies, to be clear, to advocate for rights compliance and protection in migration governance. And we do not conceive of ATDs as a magical solution or a shortcut to overnight to transformative change. But in a national context like Turkey, where there is a basic rule of law framework in place for the management of irregular migration, there is formalized implementation of administrative detention as a migration management tool. We identify the legal principles and policy proposals around the ITD concept as very helpful in terms of anchoring gradual incremental change in the direction of reducing and limiting the use of detention, but also potentially pave the way.
30 seconds.
30 seconds, potentially pave the way for a longer term transformative change. That being said, and as a last point, substantive reduction in the use of immigration detention here and now, short and midterm, in and of itself, we consider is a legitimate and valuable goal for us to pursue. Alternative detention as a means to an eventual ultimate end as a tactical approach, perhaps does not fully capture the potentials of this concept. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Many thanks, Octave. And Octave is our final speaker. Quick reflections wise, because I'm conscious of the time. Migration management can be achieved through non-detention means, and Octave highlighted quite a lot. IDC's holistic approach around ATDs has been useful when approaching decision makers as well as achieving change. And also, Octave highlighted a very important point, which is migration management must not only focus on removals of individuals, but also opening pathway as well as explore how people can be helped to regularize their stay, where with proper case management as well as other essential support such as legal support, health support, etc., which is a part of the right-based alternatives, and those things we basically see very limited in immigration detention. And also highlighted about how they have been using ATDs as one of the advocacy strategies to reduce the use of immigration detention, as well as ATDs as a tactic to reduce the use of immigration detention. And on that note, I'm going to pass on to Carolina, and also this marks the end of the panel discussion. And special thanks goes to Octave, Anderson, Pina, as well as Katharina for your great contribution. And before I pass on to Carolina, it's good to remind that the chat function will be open now so that the audience can pose questions while Carolina will be giving her final reflections. Thanks a lot. Over to Carolina.
Thanks, Mishka. And I hope that you agree with me that we are very lucky to have such an amazing group of panelists. I actually was very inspired by a lot of what was said, and also by being able to listen to so many different contexts and realities in terms of and thinking about what works, what doesn't, and how it works. I mean, I don't want to take much time here. I just want to highlight some key points that came to me from listening to these panelists. And I mean, I want to start with these community approaches and the importance of that Pinar and many of the other panelists highlighted, because I think one of the things Pinar said is the importance of people being in the community from day one. And I really like that quote, because it's in the community where people can actually fulfill the rights and can access the services they need, etc. And this is, I mean, we're looking at community approaches. We're not looking at anything else. So I think we need to have that always in our minds, and also the importance of understanding their rights. I think Anderson also mentioned something very important about the wisdom and knowledge about how we advocate and know how we read into what's happening in a national context. And this is where we need to be strategic. And this is where we can decide how we use this tactic, like this as a tactic or as a strategy towards our further end. And I think that's very important for every context, but of course it differs in between contexts. I also I thought it was very important, this issue about shifting our conversation and expanding it, to be able to work with different social movements and not stay kind of stuck with our little micro world, but try to think about ATDs beyond where we are and the sort of area where we work, but try to bring that support of other groups that are working for social change, because only through real collaboration is that change happens, and no one can achieve anything, like no organization can achieve anything alone. I think it came across from so many people in the panel, this importance of the context of ATD. We have said it, I think everyone say how ATD is so contextual, and therefore how it works differently with different realities. And Kat said that ATD has been helpful and sometimes challenging, and the importance of kind of acknowledging that, but also the importance of reclaiming this term and what it means, and how we can differentiate between ATD and what the governments call as ATD, which in reality are these de facto detentions or these alternative forms of detention, depending on ATD. I think a pretty important reflection is thinking that we actually succeeded in mainstreaming ATD, and I don't think that's a small feat. Like if you look at some decades ago, that wasn't there. But the important thing when we have achieved that is to make sure we direct or we guide the definition of the topic and the concept in the way we need. And it's not because we need it, it's because the people that are affected by immigration detention need. And this is what should be always at the front of our minds when we're thinking about how we use this as a strategy. So it's reclaiming the concept. Another reflection is this growing trend of electronic surveillance, and that is worrying across the world. And how do we analyze the use of technology, which is in what ways technology is operating? And this is something that is increasing, and I think we need to get to grips with it, and we need to continue stating how these sort of approaches don't work, and they are not ATD. On this area very clearly, and we know that we're seeing that now. And then with Octave I really like this protection-based approach to ATD and defining it that way, because basically what Octave was talking about was the community approaches and human rights as well, but also this importance of individualized approaches and the access to information and the access to legal advice and the access to service that make it so crucial for really giving an option to people. And also what they talk about, going back to context, the importance of context, but also the importance of incremental change. And we cannot underestimate the importance of incremental change, because it's better doing something and looking at that solutions-based approach rather than only criticizing something, but without offering that solutions-based approach. So we need to see how we build and how we drive the agenda rather than just criticize the agenda, if that makes sense. And at the same time, complementing it with so many different approaches, but with a proactive approach. I leave it there because I think there are some questions on the chat, but I'm very, very grateful with Mishka and with our excellent panelists today.
Thank you very much, Carolina, and thanks again to all the panelists for sharing with all of us all the reflections from your country context and from your vast experience working on ending immigration detention and using the ATD strategy as a tool for system change. We have now a very brief time for a Q&A. So the chat is open. If any of you have not realized, the chat is open. You are very welcome to post any questions on the chat that we will be then forwarding to the panelists. Also to mention that there is a possibility to write them in Spanish. It's fine for those of you who are following the event through the Spanish interpretation. And please, when typing a question, great if you introduce yourself and if you mention which panelist your question is for, so we can direct the questions to them. So we're going ahead. I'm taking the questions as they are coming. There is a question to Anderson from Pablo, who is asking if there is, the question is in Spanish, but he's asking if there is any kind of legal protection framework for children or in Malaysia, or if there is not, how is that being applied? Anderson, the floor is yours if you want to elaborate a bit on that
yeah,
part.
I mean, in Malaysia, the immigration laws do not distinguish whether if it's a child or adult or, and it's just applied to persons in general. So therefore, there is no special provision for children. And as such, our advocacy point was more on looking at how the vulnerability of children within immigration detention. And a lot of our stressing points in our advocacy was the effects of immigration detention in terms of their development and so on. And therefore, because we are also signatories to, for example, the UNCRC, there are obligations we should be applying ourselves in all elements of, our national, policies and whatever, whatever the states would do. And that was our advocacy point. And so therefore, when we push for the pilot project, because there is no legal basis that allowed us to do so. It was important that we advocated in the Malaysian context for the cabinet which will be the Malaysian ministers, to allow the pilot project to run. And because we have a cabinet approval to run the pilot project, that gives us the basis to run the pilot project and push for the implementation of the pilot. And it is with that platform we are able to run the pilot. I'm not sure whether I'm fully clear. Maybe some references may be a little specific to our national context.
Thank you, Anderson. And please, Pablo, if you would like to elaborate a bit, feel free to use the chat to do that. Thank you very much. There is another question coming from Raquel Amador, who is a board member of Justice Center in Hong Kong, and is also a question directed to Anderson. So I will pass the floor back to you, Anderson. So Raquel is basically asking about the role of ISS in Hong Kong, as apparently there is much criticism, and this is going more in the direction of what should be done in situations where there are some challenges within the civil society community. So Anderson, thank you very much again. Passing the floor to you.
Well, I mean, generally, I don't talk about other organizations, and I'll keep it as that. But I think maybe for civil societies, I mentioned this, right? There is always this tension in terms of, especially if you're an implementer, in terms of what are the constraints you are faced with when implementing, because you don't hold all the cards. A lot of times the cards are held by the state, and the state are pushing their agenda in terms of what you would like to see in the ATD program. I think with the panelists have talked about, in terms of what we therefore see, what is not in ATD, what is in ATD, and what are pushbacks are we having? And I think that constraints and those type of challenges is what I think all organizations who are, especially if you're implementing, need to deal with. And I mean, realistically, there is no answer that will make everyone happy. There are always some people, due to constraints and challenges and strategic decisions you make, which will satisfy certain groups of people and will not satisfy a certain group of people. And that's something you just have to, weigh. There are certain points which are very important being highlighted, in that discussion. Whatever you do no harm. Whatever you do, make sure it's rights-based and so on. In navigating through that constraints. And these are things which organizations just have to deal with, well or not so well, and in various contexts. I mean, in our side as well. I mean, even when we look at the implementation of ATDs in Malaysia, there are a lot of constraints as well, and they would be, at many times people who hindsight would say, no, I mean, I'm not sure whether that's a good way to start the ATD program or not to start the ATD program. But then we're left with a decision as to, how do we move forward the agenda for ATDs, creating the space and so on. And that's something which, we just have to navigate.
Thank you very much, Anderson. And you really touch upon elements that I think almost everyone have touched upon today, and mostly being these, how different and how complementary at the same time is the broader ecosystem of change of all of us working to end immigration detention, and how navigating that it depends very much on every context. It is about finding a localized solution, and it is really about looking into the specificities of each context. So thanks a lot for that reply. And actually building a bit on that, something that we intend to do as IDC, as a coalition, with both our members and also the partners that are part of this movement to end immigration detention, is to create further spaces for dialogue and engagement, to precisely discuss all the elements that are included in our strategic paper and that are happening as we go and we work in different contexts and also at different levels. For the sake of time, we are going to close the event very, very soon. So I would really like to thank everyone for being part of this. Also thank those who have posed questions in the chat. We will definitely be following up with all of you. And as I just said, we will be creating these spaces because we think, if anything, we think that what is important as we move forward is really to come together, to share strategies, to discuss the challenges, the risk, the opportunities, and really further create this community of people and support each other in a very, very complex and very politically loaded issue that at the end of the day is impacting very much the rights of people moving all across the world, and that building further a global coalition is would actually support the work of all of us. That is really challenging work. So with that being said, I'm going to pass the floor back to Carolina to just close the conversation today. And again, we're very much looking forward to continuing working with all of you. Carolina, back to you.
Thank you, Silvia. And I mean, I just really want to thank you all for your time today and for attending. And in particularly, I want to thank our speakers that as I said before, I thought they were absolutely brilliant and gave us all these very different perspectives. And also our facilitators, Mishka and Silvia, that did also a great job, and Alice that helped us opening the session today. I feel very pleased that we have been able to launch our strategy paper in this way. As it has been said before, this is ongoing work, and we will continue. We are very keen to continue working with our members and partners on continuing elaborating this approach and continue seeing what works, what doesn't, and also on checking like what doesn't work. We need to leave behind, and we need to always be innovative and try to, as I was saying before, set the agenda rather than react to the agenda. And I think this is very important. Just to finish, you can find the paper in our website. You can find the actual paper. You can find the frequently asked questions and an executive summary. And the paper is translated into Spanish and into Arabic as well. So you can find all these different languages. But we look forward to continue working with you, and we continue looking forward also to navigating the tensions that we have spoken about, but always taking into account that our aim really should be about making a difference in the lives of people affected by immigration detention and also being led by them. And if that's not our aim, then we are not doing anything. And we are wanting to work is for impact and for solutions to very, very complex problems. So thank you very much to everyone for your time. And we will also send a recording of the webinar. And thank you to Marcela for her translation into Spanish.